So as you can imagine, one of the first things that I had to do when Serum 2 came out is actually improve the way that I'm making basslines. I'm always a fan of setting up clean workflows that allows you to just play a bassline in MIDI and you don't have to worry about the resampling. And Serum 2 actually offers the perfect feature set to make something work like that within just the patch of Serum. So what that means is that this kick and bass that we're seeing over here is completely made within Serum. Of course, the kick is made within kick drum too, but the bassline is made in Serum. And the only thing that I'm doing after it is a little bit of EQing, but I would consider that part of the mixing. Really, when I'm talking about making the bassline, I mean stuff more like, of course, the synthesis, but also the phase processing that we normally do on our bassline. I like to do all of that within the actual synth, so that when I'm playing it back, even in MIDI, I'm able to set it up so that we get these clean little pockets for a bassline. As you can see here, for a kick, it is the same thing, where it returns to silence, and then the next note starts to play. But also here for the bass note, it returns to silence, or very, very close to it. And then the bass note starts to play, and here again it returns to silence, and then the kick over here starts to play. Now the other thing that I really like about bass patches is that they have a great amount of customizability. So that is the reason, for example, why I made 3000 individual wavetables which I sell as a bass table pack, so that you can substitute whatever wavetable that you want to get a different tone for your bassline. But even then, with the wavetables, I felt like the control wasn't as nice as it would have been with just a few parameters that you could change. So that is what I decided to do in this new version of my bass patch, which is probably going to end up becoming standardized in some kind of way, and then I'll just have a standard preset that I'll use for a while. Because when it comes to deciding on the tonality of the bassline, you can basically get any tone out of this patch. So the way this patch works is that it's based on a few different ideas. First of all, we're kind of decomposing the saw wave in multiple harmonics. You can see we have the subharmonic over here, so this is just set to the sine wave. Then we have the first harmonic, we can see that we have 2 repetitions. And then we have the third harmonic, so you can see that we have 3 repetitions. And then we have the fourth harmonic and everything above. And the very first thing that I decided to do was have independent volume control of all 4 of the harmonics. So you have harmonic 1, harmonic 2, harmonic 3, and then harmonic 4 and above. This of course would also allow me to have different phase controls for them. In this case, I'm not really doing that. I have these 3 set to 176 so that it's right before the click here. Starts right before when this click happens. And then we had to rotate this by 180 degrees. So this is just set to a different number, but it's going to be in phase with the original saw wave. So this setup over here should be generating at least phase-wise something that looks like a saw wave, which of course we can see it isn't doing because we can see a very processed bassline over here. So therefore you could probably already tell that a lot of the processing is going to be done in the effects here. And that is exactly where the magic is happening because we're using the exact same effects on bus 1 and bus 2. And then we have this really cool setup with this utility here and the other one, the equivalent on bus 1, which are just being targeted by these note on alt and note on alt 2 here, which are alternating like 1s and 0s of modulation, meaning that for every note, it is going to use the chain that was just deactivated. So it's just going to be alternating chains. And that means that any post-ringing that is being produced by this chain immediately stops playing when this chain starts to be playing and starts to be selected. And the whole reason why this works has to do with how effects are handled within the synth. Everything in the oscillator tab is done per voice. So what is actually going to happen is if you assign an LFO, say like LFO 9 here to, I don't know, the blend here. If I have multiple voices, it is essentially going to create multiple instances of this LFO, which are going to apply to the different voices. But within the effects, because we're already in the later stages of the synth and we're already like processing the signal that has already been generated, as opposed to actually generating the signal, it is no longer per voice, but it's just a global modulation. So what that means is that the sound is either coming from this one or it's coming from this one. There can never be a moment where they're coming from both or where they're coming from neither, because we have this alternating pattern here. And because we know that it is just going to be one instance of that, there's no doubling of these kind of modulators or something like that, like it would be in the case of the oscillator tab. It is just going to alternate between the 2 chains that are being used here. So then all we have to do is sum that together back in the main bus over here. I have velocity control over here, and I also have another modulation over here so that I can shape it a little bit more. And then finally some volume compensation and some very basic LFO controlled EQing here. Now I might say, Protector, what's happening today? You're dressed like a 60-year-old. You're dressed just completely differently. What's happening? Well, this vest is actually for my father. And sometimes, you know, he just gives me things and he supports me. Talking about support, did you know that you can support the channel by subscribing and liking the video, as well as leaving an interesting comment? You can also financially support me by checking out my Patreon or by becoming a member. And that is going to give you awesome benefits, including access to the presets that we're going to make in this video. But I'll talk about that more at the end of the video because I don't want to bore you any longer with any self-promotion. So that is basically the idea behind this kind of patch. And now I actually want to make it from scratch because I do think that it becomes much easier to see what is going on if you're making this from scratch. There's definitely a few pitfalls that you can run into as well, so I want to cover those. So I'm just going to copy over the MIDI, and then we're going to open up a clean instance of Serum 2. Going to start by turning on all of the oscillators, including the sub, but leaving the noise off, setting phase randomization to 0% on all three over here. Then I go into the first wavetable, I remove the lowest fundamental, and then I right-click to clear the high frequencies. Same thing over here, but we're going to remove the lowest two harmonics, and then remove so that we have only the third here. As you can see, I'm actually not normalizing these because I want them to be the same level as they are within this actual waveform, so that now when we remove these lowest three over here, we get an actual replacement in the waveform, and the only thing that we will have to change the volume of is going to be this sine wave. Now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to set the phase again a little bit before the point where the click is going to be. I'm going to do that in all three of these waveforms at least. It's 176, 176, 176. And because I said over here, and because like I said before, this sine wave is actually flipped in the sense that it's polarity flipped, we have to actually switch it around 180 degrees from the same phase position to get it to line up with the original saw wave. So it would be normally over here, but we add a little bit to that and we just go down by 4 from here to 356. And that means that now everything should line up into a saw wave again, especially if I set this a little bit lower. So we can quickly verify that by going into Tools and Oscilloscope. And there we have our saw wave, which is actually decomposed into multiple components. So as I said, now that we have that, we have individual control over all of these components, and we can set the levels of all 4 of them down and assign our different LFOs. So I'm just going to set this to envelope, 16 note, and I'm going to set it like this. And then holding Alt, I can drag that over here so that I don't have to copy over settings, and then just assign it here, 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 and here. And that is going to be the functionality of our first 4 LFOs. Now, the next thing that we need to do is set up the routing. And the way that I like to do it is actually only sending this through all of the processing and setting all of this to directly go out to the output. That way, we're going to get a much stabler, like low frequency sound in here. And it comes with the added benefit of potentially being able to do stereo stuff on just the higher harmonics and leaving the lowest 3 harmonics completely clean and mono. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to set the lowest 3 to direct. And then we're going to set this highest one actually to none. And then turn up both of the buses. We don't want this to go directly to our main effect chain. We want to first go to 2 of the buses in parallel, and then both of those buses go into the main output, which we can see currently is happening. Actually, I did make a slight mistake here because we do want to actually sum these together back in the main. We just want them to avoid the processing. So I'm just going to set these to main instead of direct. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to have control over the velocity, which we're going to implement in the main chain. But first, we're going to have to set up our actual processing chain. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm quickly going to hop over to bus 2 here. And I'm just going to put the utility and turn it all the way down. And now we have bus 1 to work with to actually listen to what our bassline is doing. So very first, let's go with the main filter for our bass, which we're going to set up like this. We're going to assign an LFO that looks somewhat like that, maybe a little bit lower. And again, this needs to be on envelope and 16 note. And as you can hear that is starting to sound like a bassline, I am going to make it a little bit louder for this example. But that is already sounding like a bassline. The next thing that I want to do is adding phase shift, and the way to do that, in my opinion, the best way to do that is again through the filter and through the new diffuser filter over here. What I like to do with these is set up macros so that I have macro control over some of the main parameters. Because we're going to copy this setup to bus 2, it is nice to have them linked so that you don't have to flip back and forth and make sure that all of the settings are the same, because otherwise that is something that you would have to do. So setting up key macros for your processing is definitely going to be key in this workflow. But in this case, I'm just going to set up cutoff, resonance, stages, and then mix here. and just set them up like this so that they're all going up like that. There's other types of processing that you can implement as well. For example, we could have a boat filter. This one only really works if you're modulating the mix. There isn't a clean way to shift between the phase shift that it's going to cause and just no phase shift whatsoever. The only thing that you can do is kind of turn it on and off again. And even in the middle, you're going to get some strange tonalities. But you can hear it does add a nice effect when it's fully turned up if you want a little bit more of a stronger, more phase shifted kind of sound. For now though, the one that I'm going to implement is going to be the multi-band splitter. So this split over here, I'm just going to include one individual split. I'm going to set it up so that the macro is going to churn it down more and more. And you can hear a little bit of the phase shift happening over there as well. The other one that I want to implement is going to be the compressor. Again, this is going to do phase shift depending on the multiband here. In this case, we're going to have 2 bands. And the way that I'm going to set this up is I'm just going to make sure that the compressor isn't really doing anything by just turning all of these parameters down and then making sure that the below is also down. And what we can do is we can set up both of these parameters to go higher and again, modulate them downwards so that as you turn them up, the amount of phase shift that they're actually doing increases. I mean, they're always doing the same amount of phase shift in degrees, but when they're at the lower frequencies, they're changing the waveform more and more. And therefore, having it turn up and then making sure that that turns down the frequency makes more logical sense to me as you're kind of increasing the amount of change that you're applying to the waveform. The final thing for which I like to use a macro is to set up a sub-bass phase. So the way that we do that is modulating over here and just making sure that we have almost the full range here. Those last 4 degrees, I don't really care about that. I don't really feel like that is going to make a difference if I don't set it there or if I don't have that range to be able to select. So now that we have all of our macros set up and we have all of the processing that we may want to implement on our baseline, what we can do is we can set up the actual chaining that is going to happen, that is going to make sure that we have 2 buses and that it's going to alternate between buses. So the way that you do that is you set up a utility. We set it up down here. I'm just going to set this all the way down and then mod source node alt here. I'm going to go and copy this FX bus, paste this FX bus over here, and then on this compressor, mod source node alt 2. Now, right now, our bassline is going to sound suddenly groovy, even though we have a rolling pattern. And that is because we haven't set up any of the other modulations. As you can see, when you're copying over an FX chain, it doesn't do the modulations. So we just have to set that up, meaning that this needs to go here, this needs to go here, this needs to go here, this needs to go there. And then I believe I set this up so that this one is set to the macros here and these 2 are set. Yes, okay. So you can just go here, all the way down. This one goes on the high and this one goes on the low, again, all the way down. Now, as you can hear, we have some really strong clicks and all of that kind of stuff. One of the things that we don't have is velocity control yet. And the other thing is we don't really have a main envelope for our bassline. What I would like to do is fix both of those things, which we're going to do with 2 utilities. The first one is going to be for velocity control. And the second one is going to be for our amplitude envelope. So we set that up with, again, a 1/16 envelope LFO here. Our amplitude is probably going to look somewhat like this. It's very loud now, so let's turn that down to where it needs to be. And let's also do the same with the velocity. The way that you do this is you really just set it to 50% exactly for both of them. And that should get you exactly to 0 dB. And then if you want to compensate, say that, like in this case, it's probably still going to be too loud. It is a little bit, but it's not so egregious. What we can do is we can go in here and always have another one that is just going to slightly lower it or slightly raise it if you ever need to. And now the main thing, of course, is that we have to set up all of our shapes. So for example, I want my sub bass to come in a little bit late, for example. I want my first harmonic to be a little bit late too. Maybe I want it to be a little bit lower as well. And then the third harmonic here. And finally all of this mess. You combine that with setting up the right filter envelope. And there we have our most basic form of the customizable bass patch. Now, as you can see, there's many more things that we could customize. For example, we can customize the phases here. What I like to do is doing that with size scope enabled. So if we just go look at our waveform right now, it looks terrible, right? So we definitely have to make an upgrade here because this doesn't look like the kind of wavetable that you want for your bassline. Already turning on the diffuser is a massive increase. Something like this as well, maybe a few lower stage amount here. The other thing that we can always do is start changing individual phases here. I have of course set up a macro for this lowest one here. I like to check the macro and actually hear how it sounds, almost like you're checking the phase alignment and how the continuousness of your sub bass is going to sound that way. And then from there, I will set up the sub so that it actually sounds the way that I want, right, continuously. And then phase align my kick to my bassline without actually changing the phase of the sub of the bassline again. Now, some other things that you can do is you can experiment with some band modes. In particular, I really like just setting up band plus and minus on all of these over here. That is also what we saw in the example patch, because it allows you to dial in some really interesting changes to like the lower harmonics. Of course, these should be mutually exclusive, so if we turn them up both, you're just going to get back to the exact same shape. But just setting it up like this is much easier. You can also do it with a band plus minus and just have this set to the center and maybe play with some other warp modes or something like that. But I found that just having a band plus and a band minus gives you a little bit more control, and the other band modes don't really sound nice anyway. Now, of course, we can still dial in more of our tone. We can also involve some of the other processing in here. And maybe we have to get a little bit closer with some of the harmonics and the volumes again. Now, for all of this, you may have noticed that it is still completely clean. And that's the whole point of this bass. As you can see, we're just keeping it clean, doing it like this, and I can just experiment and change tonalities and really find whatever I want without having to worry that I'm ever going to bleed into the next note and cause any issues. And that is, of course, purely because we have this final thing over here, which also helps with just making sure that it goes to silence. You can see you can actually get fairly close with this technique as well. Just setting it down like this because technically we have all of them kind of going to 0 here. So really, this is just going to be basically even stronger than most of the fades that you're going to use if you're resampling. Now, the final thing that I should probably show, because some people are going to ask, is that dynamic EQ thing. That is actually very, very simple. And I don't really care about the phase shift of an EQ like this, because this is going to be a bell. The phase shift is going to be minimal anyway. And it's going to be moving, and it's going to be like changing the phase shift because the phase shift is dependent on the steepness. And we're going to change the steepness because we're going to dynamically change the gain. So this is going to be a mess either way, and we can just put it after it. Of course, if you put it in front of it, it is going to be cleaned up. But also at the end of the day, the phase shift of a bell like this at 500 Hertz is not going to be significant for the waveform. We're going to be able to see that it's not going to actually bleed into transients or anything like that. So we just set this to envelope 16, and then we can set however we want it to change over the duration of our actual note. So maybe we want to scoop it out towards the sustain part a bit. And of course, you can set this up with a secondary EQ as well if you want another. We can actually have 4 if you're just using the other LFOs that you're left with to do the dynamic EQing. But I'm sure that with this system, with this framework, the way that I'm setting it up like this, you're able to kind of figure out on your own how to apply some of your favorite processes and stuff like that. Of course, you're going to need to be able to find an equivalent to your favorite type of processing within Serum. My main one is the diffuser because it's going to be the exact same as the disperser by kilohertz, which I find actually sounds very close to, for example, also the M freeform phase. And the way that does the phase change if I set it up in the way that I like it for basslines. The final thing that is really cool about this patch is that as opposed to wavetables and doing it everything in wavetables, you're able to do more than a cycle of phase shift. So for example, some of these lowest harmonics, especially if it was the sub that was going through, and this was an issue that I was having, so I'm going to show it. If I set this to none and then actually go through bus 1 and 2, you're going to see that we're going to get some bleeding that isn't really explained well. And that doesn't seem to, like it seems a little bit random. Let me set this a little bit lower in volume. If I close all of this now, we can see that we get actually some really strong sub there, even if we turn it off like this. Like you wouldn't expect this sub to be here, but of course now it is actually going through the phase shift, and therefore it is being phase shifted backwards in time. And in this particular case, because we're alternating notes, that means that this note is actually phase shifting into the start of this note over here. Because if it was coming from this note, it would of course be cut off by the volume actually going down once the alternating actually stops. So we don't want that, we don't want any of that, and therefore that is the reason why we go through the main here, and we're not sending all of this lower stuff through the bus. Now we just get a clean sub that just starts wherever we want and stops wherever we want. Also, we set our volume back up. And we can set up whatever shape that we want for every one of our oscillators here. Even if we want to, for this one, I would almost be tempted to do an envelope 16 or just on this process here. I mean, at this point, you're probably seeing how cool and how versatile of a bassline technique is, so I'm probably going to end the video here. What I do want to say is that all of these bass patches are going to be available up on my Patreon, so if you want them, of course, go make sure that you check out my Patreon. When I say all of these bass patches, what I do mean is all of the experiments that I've done, so I currently have 5 different ones. Some of these are duplicates with different settings, but I believe 1, 2, 3 were actually all designed from scratch, so they have like slightly different implementations and slightly different workarounds. And then 4 and 5 are going to be a copy of 3, but with different settings and with just like a different tonality, of course, coming out of it as well. And then also I'll be saving this preset that we just made from scratch, as well as the one that I made in preparation for this video. So this one might have some slight differences to it as well. And this one currently has everything named. So I'll do that for the other patch as well. So really, if you wanted to, you can just go onto my Patreon and get all of these presets. The way that I'm going to do it is it's also going to be available for YouTube members as well as Twitch subscribers. Yes, I also have a Twitch IXT dual stream on Twitch. So if you have a Prime subscription that you want to give me, there's another way that you can support the channel, and that one is even free because Jeff Bezos pays for that. But all 3 of those are going to have access to the special part of the Discord server that is just for premium members. So that is where you're going to be able to find all of these patches. Now, the final thing that I'll say is that I'm like at 80%, 90% of experimenting with this, and I would say that I haven't fully refined it yet, so all of these patches are going to be maybe a little bit less refined than you would want them to. Of course, any real presets, I'm probably going to keep them for myself, and like the actual finalized version of this idea, I'm going to just sell as a preset in one of my upcoming preset packs. As you can imagine, I'm really hyped to start working on a preset pack for Serum 2. But that's all going to be in the future, and the future is not now, because now it's time for the end of the video. So I hope that you enjoyed watching. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and make sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel, as I said before, is to check out my Patreon or to become a member down below. So thanks if you do that. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.